Thank you for being here. I'm excited. It was about a year ago, I think it was the October of last year, where I was here. At some point, we kind of went through and did introductions, and the question was, "What are you working on?" And I was like, "Well, I'm working on this EEG system." He's like, "Could you please, come back and present?" And I was leaving town like the next week, and so this past year, I've developed this system, and I'll give you a little information about what you're going to see, so you have some framework for it initially, and then this whole time can be a back and forth between questions. I can play different kits that I load into Ableton with EEG. If other people want to try it, if you're curious about what your brain does with what sort of MIDI comes out of your brain, you're welcome to try it. But it's been a really fun system to develop, test, evolve, and every time I do something with it, I learn more about it, so it's a very active process for me. And it's easily the most engaging project I've worked on in my life, so I'm excited to present it. So what we see on the screen is you'll see a visual output of my brain waves. And the different waves are delta, which is in the center. That's the red triangle. We've got alpha, which is the blue to its left. And those two are the most active waves when I'm working with electronic music. So I have put this system on an opera singer, and for her, beta and gamma were highest. And I believe that beta has to do with verbal processing and vocal. And so as she was singing opera, she was singing in Italian, she was singing in German, and her beta was really high. When I do this type of performance, you'll see my beta just kind of bounces along the bottom because it's there's no vocals, it's electronic music. I'm sure we've all experienced how electronic music is different than something with vocals. It's a different state of mind. It's more of a meditative place. It's a bit of a electronic music can be more trancing, whereas vocals, it's more of a verbal, vocal, human connection when you see a performance or just listen to vocal music. And the other one that was hired for the opera singer was gamma, which I believe has to do with breath. And so as she was doing opera singing, she was doing that circular, just belting out, so a lot of breath, and so her gamma was high. Sometimes I'll do breath work when I get pretty deep into one of these sets. If it's a long form, the longest I've performed this is like a full 1 hour, warehouse set. And the other one is, so we've got far left is beta, then alpha, middle is delta, theta is the one I haven't covered yet, and then gamma, epsilon, on the far right. Theta is similar to delta in that it's has to do with activation, stimulation. If someone were to say your name, your delta would go up. If someone honked a horn, your delta would go up. If you go from your eyes closed and then open them up, when the visual input first hits your brain, your delta goes up. Whereas alpha is more, I've found to be more of a meditative, abstract, nonverbal, musical, subconscious state. And so I use different meditation techniques to dive into different parts of my brain, and my alpha will go up. And then I have the music respond, where the music gets bassier, dreamier, and reflects the consciousness that's going on in my mind. And then I can pull myself out and back up in the delta, and the music wakes up too. The highs come back, and it becomes more of a full sound. I will show you just, the sound is off. I'll show you just the brainwaves first. So this is a commercially available EEG. It's a Muse, M-U-S-E, and it's got 5 sensors along the forehead. There are other EEGs which are much more intensive or, much more, you get a lot more data from. They're like 128 sensors. You put on this funny cap, you put in all the electrodes, and you put like a gel in each thing so it connects with your skin well. it takes like 45 minutes to put one of those on, so I don't tour with one of those. It's a little cumbersome. So I use this. It's easy to travel with. It's simple, and it gets the data I need to compose music with. One of the limitations of using this is it's only getting the electrical output coming off the front of my brain, so it's for brain activity. I'm not getting anything from the stem or the back of the brain. Whereas a full scalp one would get information from the entire head. The sensors are very similar to what you'd see on like an EKG, like a heart rate monitor. So if I'll try the back of my neck, which also works. There we go. So this is the electricity coming off the back of my neck. And I discovered this by accident once, because usually when I'm done, I just toss it around my neck like headphones, just when I take it off. And during a set, music kept going. I was like, where's it coming from? It was coming from the back of my neck. So I'll show you. So the electricity is much higher coming off my brain than the back of my neck or my arm. And when I talk, it goes flat because when the muscles move, the connectors loosen up. So some people have said, have you worn it while like dancing or moving around? And it's not conducive to that because movement can. Now I'm trying to talk without moving my forehead, and it's super awkward. That was one of the struggles with the opera singer, because when she was singing, opera is such an expressive facial expression that we just kept losing connection. It's a bit entrancing. I just fell into it. Okay, so and what I do is it's a type of Rorschach. So I'm splitting the signal and just putting out sideways. A traditional EEG would be left or right, and you see the signal. But I found it more beautiful to have it emanate from the middle and echo out. My delta is fairly high, so I'm a bit nervous, which makes sense. And then even just looking at that, I move into a nonverbal state because it's kind of like watching a fire. My alpha is fairly high. So before I play music, does anyone have like basic questions before you hear it? Yes?
What do the numbers actually mean? Like the 23 and the 19, what are they?
Absolutely. So that's a great question. So the entire signal coming out of the brain is actually a broadband wave. So it's this pulse it's this stream of electricity coming out. And then the device in any EEG uses high pass and low pass filters to isolate each band, and that creates the 5 bands. So it's actually one signal. And then within each of those bands, that electrical current has a certain decibel level, and that's what those are. They're the decibels of the electrical. So, if you see a 30, that's higher than a 5, but it's dBs of the electrical pulse. I think because of modular synthesis, people are more attuned to that, like an electrical burst or a CV, can trigger a CV. So it's interesting to literally be working with bioelectricity, brain electricity to synthesize rather than, from the outlet. That's a great question. Thank you. Any other basic questions about?
Is it exhausting or relaxing to do it?
Yeah. When I've gotten, so it's kind of like a workout. It's like going to the gym for my brain when I do particularly longer performances. So in the beginning, I was really kind of out of shape, and I would be exhausted after. I remember the first one I did. It felt like I performed for 30 minutes, 40 minutes, and later when I record them, when I later checked, it was like 12 minutes. Oh. So it was a little embarrassing. It's like going to the gym for the first time. You're like, I'm so tired. It's like, how long have I been here? It's like, 10 minutes. So as I do this system more, it's less exhausting, which is great. So I can feel the process of going different places in my brain, particularly in a setting where people are watching me. So it's very different to be at home alone. My delta is usually much lower. And that was one of my concerns with creating the system was, how do I account for that my brain's going to be different in a performance situation? Whether it's, 20, 30 people or several hundred people or 1,000 people, I need to account for these different situations. So a lot of the MIDI mapping I do actually use percentages rather than those hard decibel numbers. And so I look at the relationships between the different waves and assess, is delta X percent over alpha, and use that percentage in different ways, because that relationship is always going to, it's never going to go over 100%. It's never going to go below 0. So it was a way to map it where I had some sense of range and context, whether I was at home calm or in a performance situation and more activated.
But in the moment you think about it, isn't it like triggering the thought that it's not like you have to change something like the percentage, and then
it's constantly
the moment
changing.
you think about it, it will get more or in a different direction than you want because you think too much about it. Or is it not like this?
That's exactly it. So if I become self-conscious or I start thinking, is something wrong with the sound system or whatever, that gets reflected instantly in the music. And that was one of my intentions. Like I was just watching the back of my neck, electricity. That was one of my intentions with this system was, I've made techno since I was 19 and all sorts of electronic music. And one of the things with that is no matter how nervous I was, or if I felt bored, or if I felt distracted, or if I felt really excited about a set, as long as my hands were steady enough to turn the knobs and hit play and do the faders or whatever, people didn't know how I felt. Like the music was the music. The machine was making the music. And what's interesting to me about this system is what I'm feeling gets translated. So if I'm nervous, you can tell. If I get distracted, it comes out in the music. If I get into a really deep meditative state, that is in the music instantly. So it's using technology to become more vulnerable, more transparent, rather than hiding behind a drum machine or hiding behind a synthesizer. So it's the actual performance aspect has been more vulnerable for me as well. I did a performance in August at a festival in the United States. It was a very charged festival anyways. It was the first time I did an hour-long set, and around 25 minutes, I just started to get really emotional about the sound waves were coming out of the speakers, coming back, hitting my body, changing my brain, and then this really powerful biofeedback was happening. And in my mind, I started to see this circular loop and sometimes a figure 8 in front of me. It was based on a conversation I had earlier in the festival with a friend about the cyclical nature of time. And so I really started to get into this trippy headspace, and then that started coming out in the music. And it just felt like this immense awareness. It was like tripping really hard. Like this immense awareness kept getting closer and closer to me, and I started to cry. It was the first time I cried during a set, and I thought, do I have to take this off and take a break? I've never navigated weeping during a performance before, and so instead I grabbed the table and tried to calm down, because my delta was really just blasting out the top. I could hear it in the music, which fit the moment. It was just, it was a heavy techno set, so it was just this kick, and then the music would blast out the top, and then this kick, and then it would just blast out the top, and I just felt like I was like a rocket taking off. And so I held onto the table. I was able to come down, and the music, got more balanced again. And then around 45 minutes, it came up again. I was like, fuck it, and I just wept. I was just like, I'm gonna cry. I'm just gonna weep, and people are gonna watch me weep and watch my brain as I'm crying. And it was this really, I don't know if that was a goal early on, but it was this really powerful experience for me to feel something so deeply.
I guess in the end it felt good.
It was amazing. I mean, I came out of that it did feel like a hour-long hallucinogenic experience, and afterwards you're just like, whoa, wow, okay. And it was just a music set. I mean, I don't want to say just a music set. Music is really powerful, but so this system has helped me. It's changed me in the way that I think of music, how to perform it, and it's starting to change the way I think of how to make it, which is really powerful for me. Great question. Any other questions before we hear music?
Let's hear it.
Yes.
is your meditation practice a way of practicing as well in terms of getting more control of your brainwaves, or is that an issue for you actually to control the different kinds of brainwaves?
It is. So what's interesting about this project for me specifically is that I've meditated since I was 19. I've made music since I was 19. I've done computer programming since I was a teenager. And so it's these three different fields that have all combined into this one project. So I'm very comfortable moving from state to state in meditation. I can use different techniques just based on what sound I want. And people often ask, like, do I think of a note or do I think of a sound and then it translates through? It's not like that, and it's more like being in a sphere of fluid and moving my body around and the ripples that my movement causes in this new medium. And that's where my idea of how music is made is shifting, because it's not me pressing pads on a drum machine or playing keys on a keyboard. It's I move into this ethereal space and can psychically move in that space, and that's what shapes and pushes and ripples the music and causes it to have more notes or less notes and move up and down. So it's an entirely different way is forming in my mind of how to compose and perform.
One more short.
Sure.
The sound source. What is it like?
Yeah. So technically, what the path is. So EEG, and it's Bluetooth. The brainwave data goes Bluetooth into an iPhone app, and then that the app I made does all the data mapping and converts into MIDI, and then that MIDI is playing Ableton, and I've got different kits. So this one, I'll start with a dreamy one. So I've got 3 different kits. One is kind of an IDM, dreamy type of kit. One is soundscape, more like a bit cinematic, but a bit darker because it's my work. And then one that's kind of distorted and more aggressive. So I can point it towards any different. So I mean, once it's MIDI, I can point it towards drum machine, I can point it towards a synthesizer, I can point it towards Ableton, I can point it towards whatever. So the product that's coming out of the electricity is MIDI signals, CC, tempo, note on, note off. Anything that you can do with MIDI is, I can map it. Okay, get started. So that is one of the sound kits, and I guess I did get pretty deep in that. So sometimes it's hard to transition back to talking. Any specific questions now that you've seen it? Yes.
Yes, amazing.
Thank you.
I work in sonification, so I do like this kind of stuff scientifically, and it's amazing.
Oh, great. I'm glad you're
I'm
here.
gonna talk to you later.
Yeah, absolutely.
What are your like choices for like you have this kind of noisy signal, right? And then you kind of somehow map it to MIDI. Do you filter it before? Like, is there like how is the linkage of say like the proportion of delta versus alpha or whatnot to the actual like how do you translate it into your design choices for the sound for the music that you're creating?
What was the last part of the last sentence?
Like how do you like the whole chain from data, like then there's some sort of processing, and then there's MIDI mapping, and then you have the design choices of the soundscape that you're
Yes.
creating, right? So
Yes.
I'm really interested in that, especially the last part of it.
Absolutely. I'll cover the beginning part briefly then. So the device itself does a lot of the noise separation, getting the signal from the noise. And so the data I get off of this device are simplistically 5 streams, one for each. So there's an alpha stream that's constantly being sent, beta, delta, gamma, theta. Once it comes into my app, so the streams come in, and then I make different decisions based on the different streams. And every time I do a build, I often tweak what gets data mapped to what. In general, I've used certain waves to be LFOs or to control an LFO depth. I've used increases and drops, and the system has that, increases and drops to either add notes or pull notes out. So a note on, note off. This particular build doesn't have a loop in it. So if I'm doing a techno set, there's a looping sequencer in the app, and so I can put kicks in, and then they'll stay, and then I have to mentally clear my brain to pull them back out. This one is just a more live, instant expression of my brain. So when you'd hear a kick, it's because a note is being added, but there's no looping sequencer in this build. The alpha and the delta, the relationship between them, it's a complex mapping, and there's a lot of parameters that are looking at that. And in the mapping, do I have that? I think I do. Great. Sorry for the brightness. Do I have the data mapping? I do not. That's the harmonics. So I'll explain it. There's different ranges of filters and effects that I use to shape the different channels, and that percentage of the relationship between alpha and delta can affect those different channels in different ways, and each one has a different sensitivity to it. So one filter may be very sensitive to the movement in the brain, the other one may just move it 30%. And so that's the combination of taking the data, doing the technical data mapping, and then making creative decisions with the sound design. And that's something I feel fortunate at, in that I have enough experience with engineering that I can program this, and enough experience with music and sound design that I can make those creative choices to make something that I enjoy and am excited about. I know some engineers who can do something similar, but it comes out as just. And technically, that's accurate. Maybe that's. I'm sorry. Is that literally what you do?
Well, not like that. Talk about later.
And the irony was, we mentioned the Euphonia festival earlier. They just wanted a sonification. They didn't want music compositions. And so I thought, I've worked all year to do music composition. And I come to Berlin, I just do. I mean, I put some reverb on it so it sounded better, but it was literally just sonification of my brainwaves. I brought them up a few octaves so they'd be audible, but this is the heart of it is music composition. Did that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay.
And that's like the thing. Like I work with sonification, but like at the heart, I want to make music. So
Yes.
it's nice.
Yep.
Just a short question. So you're
Yes,
just
please.
using the levels and not the actual waves. You're just using the levels of the waves. So like what we're seeing.
Oh yeah. Let me think of. I'm using the levels and doing relational algorithms between the levels. That's why I enjoy presenting this and talking about this, because are you thinking of like the dynamics or the history of it or its movement over time, that's what came to mind.
Yeah, because normally when you see brain waves, it's like the waves itself, in, I don't know, 2 hertz or something, or 20 hertz in low level, and here we just see like the intensity of the waves, like the decibel.
Yep.
But your app is just using this intensity of the different waves and of the like
Frequency.
not the frequencies
Yep.
in 2 or 20 hertz, and just upscaling it.
So the frequency I'm not using in this system. So with Euphonia, I did use the frequency.
Yeah, you just
Exactly, and the delta, which is the lowest, became the sub bass. You know, I popped it up 30 hertz. You know, from like 1 up to 30 some. And so I kept them in the same range. And after I did that, I realized the next step for the visuals is to be able to turn the waves sideways and be able to see them in a row, because right now they all look like equal standing, but the red one is actually the lowest wave coming off the brain in terms of bassiness. And then I wouldn't say it goes up to treble, but the which one's highest? Gamma, which is one of the grayish ones, because I don't use it much in techno. But gamma is the highest frequency one, and so the next design I want to show, be able to turn that model a bit so you can see. And I'm going to learn more too if I have a visual of what the different waves are doing at a given moment. And what I'm curious about is when I have some sort of psychic movement or energetic movement in my brain, does it ripple through the different frequencies in a sequence of like top to bottom or bottom to top? With this system, I can just see them go up, but I don't necessarily know if there's a where in the frequency range it is. And so I think the more data I end up designing and mapping to the visuals, I'll learn more and then be able to then control more.
Yeah.
The goal of the system is every time I do a new build to make it even more and more responsive to my brain. Whereas the first build was the least responsive. Every time I create a new build, it gets more and more fine-toothed.
The stuff we see in the background, like that looks a bit like a 3D movie or something. What's this?
What is that? So in the background, this is a still of it, but when I fire up the system again, that background is actually footage I took in high school with a VHS camcorder, like the big, heavy. And I did this whole thing where I pointed the camera into the TV and did a feedback loop and got all these abstract shapes. And so I took those, digitized them as I was working on this project, slowed them down, and then I put a filter on it, a tint on it, either blue or red, depending on if I'm in alpha or in delta. And so it's a way to have, my brain is controlling the color and the loops of the video, and it's a way to have something that feels like the psyche kind of moving behind the wave. So it's an aesthetic decision, but the aesthetics of what you see
Like a dreaming or something.
Yeah. A question back, yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering, this is an instrument, basically. If we take this as a metaphor for an instrument,
Yep.
when a musician is playing her instrument, she has an idea of virtuosity, how virtuosic she is. How do you feel in terms of your level of virtuosity, in terms of controlling your brain waves as an instrument?
I feel more skilled than anyone I've given it to, just out of sheer practice. That feels a bit arrogant to say, but the way and that's a good metaphor for it, the way I think about this system is it's kind of like a drum kit, that anyone could walk up, grab sticks on a drum kit, and make sound. So anyone who puts it on tonight, and I would love if someone was more virtuoso than I, in terms of just being able to like launch into the fourth dimension with it. So anyone can make sound with a drum kit, but as you get more skilled with it, you can do really amazing things with drums.
How do you? What are your scales and arpeggios, and what is your exercises? You know, like if you're a trumpet player, you have all these different patterns you play. A pianist plays different.
Oh yeah. Meditating.
Okay.
Yeah, just doing a morning meditation. And that's one of the nice things is that practice just launched right into
Do
it.
you have this on while meditating? Usually, always, sometimes, never?
Occasionally. So this device is actually sold with a meditation app. That was the original intention for it. And at the time, they had an API on their website. So I grabbed it and I was able to use it. They actually pulled the API since, which is a huge bummer. But I nabbed it in time, so I'm able to develop with it, which is very fortunate. But just sitting and meditating, doing creative thinking, a lot of times I think about the project. So it's just exercising different parts of my brain and different types of meditation, but also different energetic, like moving upwards. The word meditation, I usually think of going deeper into something. And this is a system where I can also go up the scale because of the stimulation from the music. And this was something I experienced at that festival this summer. So normally I can go a bit into, my mind can go a bit up into activation or a bit down into relaxation and meditation. And with this system, so if I go up, the music then follows me. And then that becomes the new floor. And if I'm doing it for a long period, then I can go up further than I could without the system. And then the music meets me. And then I can get to these really levels where the only thing stopping me is just the emotional, getting too overwhelmed emotionally. And then I have to come down so I don't know what would happen, but explode. And then same with going down. So I can go deeper into a meditation and then the music follows. And it got, there were some times during the performance tonight where I went down and my brain really got clear. I really got into a space and then because the music goes down, then I can go deeper and the music goes down and I can go deeper. So it's increased my range when I use it with sound. But yeah, typically just meditating, and then every time I perform it, I get more skilled at it.
I mean, I assume just the way you're talking, that you've had some psychedelic experience. So has that helped you also get to these states?
So I haven't done psychedelics in 21 years. I've been sober a long time because I did too many psychedelics. But it absolutely stays with me in terms of understanding that the power of imagining something. This is a bit new age stuff too, but just the power of imagination, and then it becomes real. And so this was a project that actually started with a dream. And then I just started moving forward as if it was going to be real, and then it started to come together. And even the mechanics of the project, I'm thinking, and sound waves are coming out of the mechanical devices of the speakers. And then my brain hears that, and it's like, you just made that. And it becomes this really enthralling biofeedback loop. I think just as much of influence was, as a kid, I really liked comic books like X-Men and, Xavier, and being able to do like telepathy and telekinesis. And so that also was an inspiration of, can I do something with my mind and change something physically in my environment? The first time I did a test with this when I first bought this, and did just a simple test where can I do a MIDI note on and note off with my brain. And so I programmed just the earliest version of the app, had the MIDI plugged into a modular setup that had a little light that would light up if it received a MIDI signal. And I put it on and like cleared my brain, and you know, while watching light, just like and I saw the light go off, and it was Eureka is the best description of that type of experience, where I just pressed a key on a keyboard with my brain and letting that sink in of like, if I can do a note, I can eventually do a full symphony. You know, just build on the system and build on this system and build on this system. So once that one proof of concept worked, it was just, I don't know if it's telepathy with the machine, like I'm getting into the machine's brain, or if it's telekinesis so I'm still debating what term to use. It's kind of both.
Is it possible to have a look on your Ableton setup?
Sure. I realized I did not bring a jack on. Do you have a Thunderbolt HDMI?
I don't have any adapters.
Okay.
Yeah.
Does anyone have a Thunderbolt HDMI? That's the one. I left it in America. What I can do.
Actually, quick question. So
Or after the talk.
You can do, yeah. Jason, you can pause it afterwards.
Okay, but I'll show you. It's quite unassuming. So it's I'm using different. It's called instrument. You know, the different synth, and just chose different settings. Let me bring this back.
How does it differ if someone is experienced with meditation or not at all? Like, I mean, it's also what counts as meditation is also like a wide range, I guess. But
Absolutely.
What someone who is not meditating thinks it's meditation, like this, like getting super calm. If you don't use this at all, or what's the outcome then? Is it just up or?
Not necessarily. So I mean, everyone's brain has electricity being emitted from it all the time, and that electricity just naturally ebbs and flows with stimulation or calmness, and so something always comes out of the system. Does anyone else want to try it just as a test? Yes. And what sound kit? Do you want? Soundscape, dreamy IDM that I played, or like a harsher, like distorted one?
I think
Soundscape. It's loaded. Come on up.
What was the first? I have another question. What was the first thing you thought about or you did with your face to have like a triggering a MIDI note? Were your first like?
Tonight?
No. I mean the
general.
first time when you had the light, for example.
Yes.
Then I mean you try to find a way to like to push the alpha higher and then to trigger the MIDI note or something. And then I would try to think about something or to make like open my eyes and close it again and to try to trigger with that my MIDI note. What was your first?
The first trigger, so what I found in that first day of using this was that all my waves were quite high.
Mm-hmm.
But, so I was concerned, would just notes be constantly be triggered if the notes are always high?
Yeah.
And that very first test was I was clearing my mind, and when the delta dropped below a certain level, it was note on, and then when I woke up my brain again was note off.
Okay.
So it was I inverted it, I went down.
Yeah.
Kind of a funny side note is the way I clear my brain during this. I've gotten better at it without having to use this tool, but the best way to get all my brain waves to drop, which is usually when I pull notes out of the sequence or the sequence gets calmer, is I look at my phone. So looking at your phone, like your brain just drops.
Like looking at your Instagram.
No, seriously. And so it's like the most effective way to get my entire brain waves just to like go to the lowest possible level. So I just look at my phone and just kind of tune out.
Yeah.
Nothing else works as good as that. So just a little food for thought.
So try that too.
I can help you with it. So it actually clicks tighter. Like that.
Yeah, like
Yep.
headphones.
Yep, just like headphones. But that's a pretty good position on your forehead. Let me reconnect with it.
Okay, it works. No, it works. It works quite intuitive.
Good.
Yeah, I tried different thoughts. Like when you heard the kick and it was getting louder, I was thinking about a scream. I was trying to scream very loud in my head.
Very cool.
And when I tried to stop to scream and look back to the phone, it was immediately getting quiet.
Yep.
So yeah, when I was looking to the phone screen, immediately stopped. And then I tried to scream again in my head, like very loud, like "Wah!" to think about the scream, and then kick started. Yeah, so like it worked 3 times in a row.
So are you a musician? Or?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe for you too.
Any questions about what you just saw?
Well, if I put together some questions that I hear today, in the way how I see this device, for me, this is right. I'm agreeing with him that this is like a music instrument, right? And this device is like a recorder of those frequencies that is coming from that instrument, the mind. Have you considered the possibility to try this kind of recorder in different kind of minds? Let's say, how would it sound this in the mind of a psycho, for
Sure.
example?
Yeah.
Depressive person, Yogini.
I have tried on different people. At that, I keep mentioning that same festival. It was a long festival with a lot of things with this. So I did find a friend that was coming off of a trip and was able to put it on her. Her brain was fairly normal. It looked like a normal adult brain. When I
Yeah, what's normal?
I think similar to what we've seen tonight, just the fairly balanced waves, maybe a little bit higher on the delta with stimulation. I have put it on when really sad and the waves were lower. There's less dynamics. I've put the EEG on. A friend of mine has a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, and so I tried it on both the kids. And the brain of a 4-year-old is quite smaller, and there's just not as much electricity coming off of it. So the music was actually very mellow and just kind of bounced along the bottom. Even just the time between 4 years old and 6 years old, her brother put it on, and right away, more dynamics. There was more electricity coming off his brain. And then the dad put it on, and it was the full range of dynamics. And that's one of the sources for composition, is the dynamics of the electricity creates more dynamics in the music in terms of movement and sound and range of sound. So that's the biggest jump I've seen, is the age of the person, a child's brain versus adult brain. I've had many different adults try it. Sometimes I see higher levels of gamma and beta in women, and then more alpha, delta in men, although that's not entirely consistent. I need to do more testing with that. Someone who's mostly blind put it on, and the waves looked pretty identical to other brains. And this also might be one of the limitations of this particular device, because I'm only getting 4 brain. So some of those changes might be in other parts of the brain, because there is different types of electricity coming off the brain. Another factor is, so let's say I put it on someone that was mentally ill. Are they currently in like a manic state, or are they, at something like this and just like, hey, can I put that on? Like it depends on the environment a lot, what the brain is doing, what it's reacting to. I've not got permission to like go into like a mental hospital and be like, hey, can I put this EEG? And that was one of my challenges at the festival, is I did want to see what a brain that was peaking on LSD would look like, because I've got a version of the readout where I could at least capture the data, do a screen recording. But it's hard to wrangle someone who's tripping hard and be like, let's leave the dance floor, let's go back to my car, and I'm going to put some weird device on you. And I'm going to record your thoughts. So that didn't happen. I would like to seek out an art grant where I can do a controlled study, where I'm with someone during the whole trip and record all the different phases. I want to get the system more responsive before I go through the process of doing that, because I really want to hear what the brain does in different phases of a trip, because it's almost, there's so many emotions condensed into such a short period of time. So it's a sort of a way to get a lot of data quickly.
But
In the back.
Yeah. Did I understand right that the electricity is coming from your frontal cortex then?
Yes, I mean it's coming off of the whole brain, but these sensors are only going across. So that's the only electricity that I'm picking up with this system specifically.
The cerebellum is not really being picked up on, or any of the other lobes in the back, or is
I would need sensors closer to those.
Right.
So that's the advantage of the full scalp one, is that you're going to get sensors in back. One of the interesting things I learned from a neuroscientist a few months ago was his theory about alpha waves. So I associate alpha waves with music and subconscious. His idea with alpha waves is they're actually a suppressant, and so they suppress stimulus so you can focus. And one of the interesting things with alpha waves, if you have a full scalp EEG on, is if I'm in a really noisy room and I'm trying to focus on my conversation just with you, my alpha waves will go up spatially all around my brain, except in the one field of vision where I'm trying to. So if you're in a club or a bar or a noisy restaurant, your alpha waves are going up to block out all the other noise so you can focus on the one signal. You can still hear it, but your brain is suppressing the priority of that stimulus in order to have focus.
I guess for someone who's not used to the music you do or we are used to,
Yeah.
this could also be a problem if they use your kit that's quite, like, for example, the harshest one.
Yes. I
Some
will
people
play that.
like I lost completely the like what's hard or what's extreme or what's not easy for other people. If someone who's not used to the sound that's coming out, then it can also be a problem or a challenge.
Yes, yeah. So if there's an abrasive kit and someone puts it on and they're like, "Oh, that's my brain," that can be quite disorienting. I did a talk with this. It was an educational forum back in America, and it was a lot of kids. And so I actually created a kit that was a little more playful because I didn't want these kids to be scared. You know, like, "Oh, that's what my brain sounds like," because some of my material is darker. And so that's something I was conscious of is I didn't want them to be alarmed. Yeah.
To seize this, I work with my teacher, or my teacher is working on epileptical patients. So there are some neuroscientists of his university, and he also made the brain waves audible of those patients from epilepsy.
Epilepsy.
And it was so interesting because in the normal state of the brain, when you make it directly audible, he did like a amplitude modulation to a synthesizer, that you can hear the sound very good. And in the normal brain state, it's very chaotic. You hear like, and when an attack is beginning, everything is stopping, and at first you hear like one side of the brain, and it's making whew, 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 and it's getting very slow and very ordered.
Wow.
The ordered state is the state where it's where your brain is not working anymore. So the chaotic state is the normal state.
Oh, that's interesting.
And that's why maybe from you when you told me you're triggering the note when you're relaxing, and it's kind of invert, and that was also kind of invert of what we would think.
Right.
It was interesting.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so getting back to with this system rather than one that's actually playing your brainwaves, it's interesting how hard it is to convince people that isn't what your brain sounds like, when it's real easy for people to understand that a piano is not what their fingers sound like.
Yeah.
But it's just there's this block that people have where they can't understand that they're just playing a piano with their brain.
Right.
And it's weird how that you've run into that because you're kind of nodding along how people just sort of jump to this. Oh, this is what my brain sounds like.
Right. Yeah.
And it's hard to convince them it's not.
I think one of the things that helps is the visual display, and one of the similar.
It seems like that would make it even worse.
Really?
Yeah, because now those actually are the waveforms.
They literally are the waveforms.
Yeah, but that the drum set is not how your brain sounds. So
Right.
like the noisy set is not how your brain sounds.
Yep.
The funny kid set is not how your brain sounds.
Right.
It's just settings on a piano keyboard that you play with your brain.
I often explain. I use the drum metaphor because I think that
but
helps.
that's how it is. What your hands sound like. You can hit the drum with your hands or whatever. I think it's better to be like an electronic keyboard because those sounds are literally. There's no direct connection between the sound set and the trigger.
Yeah, it's MIDI coming off of this,
Yeah, exactly.
and as I continue to develop this, the next phase I see is being able to isolate each instrument individually and use just oscillators and one at a time be able to shape that sound and then move on to the next sound and shape that and create compositions that way where there's a more direct relationship between what my brain is doing and the oscillators in a synthesizer.
But it's not quite there yet right now.
This is playing instruments in Ableton.
Keyboard. So,
this version is MIDI.
I just find it interesting that there's a lot of this stuff, and I've been thinking about, I teach a lot, and think about teaching, but just how hard it can be to explain that to people, and they still are like, oh, this is what my brain sounds like.
Sure.
And I'm just wondering about your experiences with that disconnect.
It hasn't been too bad when I do explain. I think the drum kit metaphor helps. And for whatever reason, maybe I say that earlier when I present, but it was harder in the beginning, maybe because I didn't have the right language for it yet.
Yeah.
But that is the goal, is that I want to be able to have this respond more and more uniquely to each brain.
Yeah.
And so as it becomes more fine-tuned and more responsive, when I put it on, or you put it on, or you put it on, that it will be a different composition.
And it'll become a guitar instead of a drum
Yes,
set.
exactly. The actual instrument will
That would be
transform.
like
That's
the
important to me.
next level, the totally next level.
Exactly.
I already think on my sounds that I create with my music using with this. So it is like then you come close to what my brain sounds like when you are satisfied with the outcome of the drum kit.
Mhm.
Like when this is what you think it should sound. It's not directly the brain, but it's your creative part of the brain that created a drum kit. That's yeah. I mean, it's more when you use your drum kit. It's more
Sure.
more your brain than someone else uses your drum kit.
Right. Yeah. Someone else putting this on now, it's going through the filter of the sounds I chose in Ableton and the sound design I did with the different instruments. So that is. Yep.
I'm curious what parameter is triggering the kick, and how
Mhm.
reliably can you trigger it, and do you accidentally trigger it, or does sometimes if you trigger it, does that cause you to have a reaction which
Sure.
triggers it again or something?
Sure.
How fast did you go so far?
In terms of kicks.
Yeah. Is speedcore possible?
Oh, it is. My tempo on this is. I can set a tempo range and have it respond to the activity in my brain, but this is like 65, so we're pretty chill tonight. The trigger for the kick on this one. Let me think about this build.
Just because it seems like it's quite an intense sound compared to everything else. Like it's
Mhm.
much louder, and obviously that must have an effect on your brainwaves when you hear it.
When I hear it, yep. This particular system, just a second, my computer fell asleep. This particular build, the kick and the sub sounds are on movement of the alpha, and so as the alpha, actually as it's going up, I often invert it because when my alpha goes up, I feel like I'm going deeper into my subconscious, so I'm using a down gesture. But as I'm diving into my subconscious, there are certain trigger points that there's certain regions, and as the decibel of the alpha wave crosses those trigger points, it does a note on that kick sound, and as it goes deeper, it hits a sub sound, like a sub bass sound. And then when I move back up, it can trigger it again. So it's about dynamics and movement through different spaces, and it can be intentional. Sometimes it does trigger just as my brain is doing activity, or I can really focus on, okay, this is where I want to go and dip down. The process of moving through this space is similar to like moving through a fluid. So it's not as direct as, being able to pick something up, but it's like steering a boat. You make the decision and then you are drifting through this fluid. And so that up and down movement is, okay, now I'm gonna, and then you kind of feel the dive. So it's not as tactile as turning a knob,
Yeah.
but it's
So you can decide, like, I'm going to just do like a straight 4/4 beat and be able to make your brainwave cross that point at the right time.
yeah, and what I'm learning, and this came up just this last week, is the bigger challenge with that is that the brain, a lot of its functioning is predictive, and so the first time I think about, so sometimes I can get different levels go up if I think about moving my body but don't actually move my body, or if I think about talking but don't actually talk, I can get a spike. But if I try it again, it doesn't work because my brain knows that I'm trying to trick it. And so that predictive functioning would prevent me from being able to do through because the flow of the brain, it's I believe because it's quite efficient, and so it doesn't want to discharge that electricity over and over, knowing that it's not actually, it's manifesting something because the EEG, but it's interesting because I have to work with the efficiency of the organ as it's designed. and getting it to, it falls for the trick the first time, but then it wants to flow the way it wants to flow, and then I kind of have to wait until it's ready again. So it's become a bit of this spiritual experience. Often in meditation, sometimes it's like, okay, I get deep, and then I start to feel something come up, almost like a shy animal comes out of the woods. And then if I'm like, hey, grab onto that, it runs. The brain is like that too. And so, when the kick, if I'm in the space of like, oh, now the moment is right, I can dip down, but I can't trade it. Do you get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's a elusive, it's
Kind of like trying to control a dream.
Yes, exactly. And it's this is a new realization, so it's I don't have the best words for it yet, so I'm stumbling a bit, but I think you get what I'm saying. That's a great metaphor, is trying to control a dream. It's like you kind of can. Yes?
Yes, there's a question.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I didn't see you.
Have you tried, or what happens if somebody touches you, pinches you or something?
Mhm.
Like, what is that doing with the sound?
So my delta would go up. So if I were in a deep state, kind of that bassy, alpha, dreamy state, it would pull me out of it pretty quickly, and you'd hear it. The sound would brighten up and wake up, and it kind of feels like coming out of water. It's like shh, and then you start to hear the highs again. So it would be a delta spike.
So there wouldn't be a bass or something?
No, it's the opposite. It would wake me up. Yeah.
It's maybe I can explain something with my new point of view, because I never tried that before, and for me it was like, okay, what is happening here actually? Because you could also just play a track and it's wearing this thing, for you as you're sitting here, it's very, well, what is he doing here actually, or how does it feel? But for me it was crazy, because I was wearing it, and then I tried to think about different things, or try to relax myself and get to a meditative. And at first it was not possible for me to play kicks. At first it was like impossible to get low frequencies, only the high frequencies.
Mm-hmm.
And then I tried different things, and only when I got to this point where I started to scream in my head and where it changed everything. And then it took like 5 seconds after I changed my head when the sound actually began. So it took like 5 seconds afterwards. But when I stopped, like looking back to the phone, it was immediately that was kind of direct. But it's not that direct that you can like say, okay, now kick, and you can like think about a beat and you would hear the beat or something. It's more like the state of your brain, and you have to get to a different level of your brain to have some other frequencies in the sound.
That's exactly it. Yeah. Another possible metaphor is it's almost like telling a joke. Like there's a certain timing for it, and then you tell it and it lands. You can't tell the same joke a minute later. It's just it won't have the same impact. And so working with the brain is that way, where it's like, okay, now's the moment, and it's like dive down. There's a big, kick or bass sound. Oh, okay. and then it's hard to get the brain to like do that again. So it's so much about spontaneity and movement, and that's using this tool and using my brain as a composition source. It's changing the way I think about music composition, because I'm used to working with machines where it's like, yeah, a kick and another kick, and it will hold on to that. So I'm exploring compositions that are more, I guess, organic would be the word.
It's more like the dolphin game on PlayStation. Like back then.
That's exactly it. That's exactly it.
I have kind of a second part
Yes,
to
please.
that question. Is there, it's probably hard to gauge it because you can't sort of tell in your head directly when you've made a change to your brainwaves, but do you feel like there's a delay between the time that your brainwaves are changing to the time that it's actually triggering the changes in the MIDI, like going through the Bluetooth and then going through the phone and into the laptop?
Technically, it's quite fast. There's a slight delay because I'm quantizing it. So it's not, I think it's quantized to an eighth. Just so if there's a bunch of beats, it's not complete chaos. So the delay that I experience is just from the quantization. But in terms of responsiveness, and I can hear the texture of the sound change instantly, because those are control changes just constantly feeding into the MIDI device. um, when I feel the state change, there's almost instant biofeedback from the audio waves, and that's what creates the power of that biofeedback.
Yeah, I think the delay is bigger from if like you want to think something else, but until your brain is really sending something else, I think that is a bigger delay than the actually technical part.
I guess there could also be a delay between like when your brainwave's changing to when you actually recognize that it's changed in your own brain, and then that could be almost like lining up with the delay with the audio.
Sure, it's like a latency fix.
Is it
One of the things.
Is it better to know the sounds, or is it not important to know what can be played?
The brain learns, and I always assign, kicks or basses to the same movement. So I don't switch. I haven't switched those around. I think that'd be confusing. What I'm used to, like a high delta sound, all of a sudden it being a kick.
Okay, so it's like everything is somewhere in the room or in this thing. But do you have this sometimes that you want to play something, but it's not. The sound is not coming down.
It can happen, but that's part of the spontaneity. I mean, what's interesting about the experience of using it is it's moving into an improv space. So it's really just like feeling the moment and being like, okay, now we go here. And
the
then
more you use it, the more the less it would happen.
Yeah, it's like getting better at improv, or just being able to trust that moment, move into the moment, and then move back out of it. If I'm trying really hard to force something, it may be difficult for it to come out.
So you can't literally score.
Sorta. It's rudimentary now, but I see as the system gets more sensitive, being able to score.
Except this thing of your brain being like, yeah, I'm not feeling for that.
Could be. Although if I were like scoring a film.
No, like playing off of a score, like playing the same piece. Like
Oh.
a written piece.
No,
That's what I meant by a score.
No, I don't think so. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think you can do that.
Yeah. No.
Maybe with abstract scores like John.
Yeah, but I mean like an actual like.
Yeah, sheet music. Yeah. I mean, I can't play sheet music even with like my fingers.
Maybe you can play another set now.
Yes, I would love to play the. It's not super distorted.
An abstract score is still improvisation.
Yeah.
one of the trickiest things when trying to calm things down, or at the end of a set to try to bring the levels down. At some point I have to remove the device so it loses the electrical connection and the input stops. It's even the idea when I start to think, okay, I'm going to take this off, the electricity goes up because the brain is so predictive that before I move, the electricity for a movement starts. And so this one worked out kind of well. But in the past, sometimes I've had to move my hands up to the device first and then let my brain get used to that. It's really like trapping an animal. It's like, okay, get a little closer, everything's fine, and then pull it off before the electrical stimulation comes off. So I've learned a lot about the brain just using this. I want to be conscious of everyone's time. It's 9:30. How about 3 more questions? And then if you want to talk to me more afterwards, I will be here as long as anyone wants to chat.
What kind of languages did you use to go from the phone application to actually send MIDI messages to live?
I'm using Swift, and so I built all my frameworks in Swift.
Great. 2 questions.
Yeah, please.
Have you done couples or brainwaves or even brainwave orgy?
Great question.
Just going off what we're saying about getting the brain to kick and maybe the power of the MTU. And then if no one else is going to do it, maybe you could explain a bit, someone in their alpha state or someone who's very distracted and not a lot of practice with meditation, with your parameters or controls, what it would sound like. If you could just explain.
Sure. So I only have, I've only coded one to connect at once, so I haven't done multiple people, but that is something I'm interested in. I wrote a grant application for exactly that a while ago because I want to see, particularly if people know each other well, if their brainwaves start to harmonize, particularly if they're like sitting next to each other or lying next to each other, if they start to see some parallels in their systems. And I would like to be able to use information from multiple brains and then match that data together to compose. That's interesting to me. This whole system began when I had a dream about making music from DNA sequences. And so future versions of this will use the way DNA is formed, the way variants are formed, and the way DNA interacts with someone else's DNA. I want to use that structure to create a long form set, like an hour set. So I'll have a certain DNA imprint, and then a new one will come in. And that new one could be a new snapshot of my brain in that moment, or it could be from someone else. And then their mental DNA map and my mental DNA map make the next hybrid version where some of my attributes and some of their attributes. So that is a really interesting area I want to go into. The second question is if someone is unfocused and can't get into alpha, what happens? Was that the question?
Yeah, if I were to just throw that thing on.
If you're like stressed out and distracted.
Yeah, with your setting, with your parameters.
If someone is stressed out or distracted or nervous, it'll just be the higher sounds. It'll actually cut out the bass because it was important for me to have a parallel between the mental state and the aesthetic of the sound because I want those to reinforce each other. So if I'm feeling grounded and deep in my subconscious, then I can get all those bass and guttural sounds to come out. If I'm stressed out, there's a high pass filter that trims off the bottom, and it becomes this really kind of higher sound, but also has some reverb so it can blast out if it really peaks. So there's a parallel there. And then one more question from someone who hasn't asked a question. Or you.
I just wanted to ask something maybe other people are thinking. Are you developing it to become commercially available? Like, is it something you want to sell as a product?
I'm not sure yet. It's not far. I'm still so much in the process that I don't want to interfere the process with like a product development map and VC funding breathing down my neck to like get the next version done. I mean, it's been such a intuitive process to create this that I want that to be able to unfold fully on its own. If it gets to a point where I feel like there's everything I could do in terms of making it responsive and interesting for whoever puts it on, I'll consider that then. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you so much.